If we're going to think seriously about togetherness and the ways in which social research should engage with this question, we need to look at the negative lessons that community psychology gives us when it thinks about the togetherness of a community. There are critical community psychologists who try to go beyond these problems, but the four problems still remain in the practice of much community psychology. The first problem is that there's a homogenizing of the community which obscures the ways in which power structures operate and the ways in which some people are able to speak and others are kept silent. So when a community psychologist goes into a community, they usually talk to community leaders who define what the community looks like. They give a certain representation of the community, which closes off the voices of those who are unable to speak, those who are unable to speak because of their class position, because of their gender, because of their sexuality, because of their exclusion on the basis of disability, for example. The second problem is that there's a pathologizing of those who are not contributing to the accepted ruling definition of what a community is. We know from social theory that the ruling ideas are always the ideas of those who rule, of those who define what the community should look like to their benefit. And those who don't conform to that image of the community are then pathologized. They're excluded. They're shut out, and they're often excluded on two bases. One is that they are simply excluded and not listened to. But the second problem, and this is where psychology comes into the frame, they're excluded because the kinds of distress that they show at not being listened to are pathologized as well, pathologized as a kind of mental distress. A third problem in much social research that community psychology repeats is that there is control of the community. When the psychologist listens to the community leaders, and that control reproduces a colonial relation between the social researcher and the community. There's a problem there, which is that the research agenda of the community psychologist or any other kind of social researcher is set by the funding agency. You talk to a social researcher, whether they're a community psychologist or sociologist or anthropologist, it's very, very clear very soon when they're describing the aim of the research that they have to get that research carried out within a certain time period and within certain parameters. You go beyond those parameters, and if you go beyond the time period, then you'll find yourself in trouble. You'll find yourself in trouble as a member of the community. Find yourself in trouble with the psychologist or the social researcher. And the fourth problem, and this is a very serious problem, is that good citizens are defined by the social researcher, which is in line with the idealized, homogeneous image of the community. A notion of togetherness in which the psychologist leaves behind them little replicas of themselves, the little psychologists who will be the good citizens when the real psychologist has left the research. And that good citizen reinforces the idea that there is one representation of the community, which is homogeneous, which rules out the conflicts in the community. What we need to do instead is to draw lessons from quite traditional anthropological research in the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, for example, with the Winnebago Indians in what is now the United States, where he noticed that the accounts that members of a community give of the togetherness of a community vary depending on their position in the social structure. So if you ask someone who has power and privilege to draw an image of the community, they will draw a circle with a line down the middle. The fantasy, the ideological fantasy here, is that anyone can move from one side of the line to the other. It's a fantasy of meritocracy, a fantasy of togetherness, which makes it seem as if power structures are unimportant. Whereas if you ask those without power to give a definition and a representation of the community, they will draw a circle with a smaller circle within it. And the smaller circle, of course, represents those with power, those with the ability to define what the community is. And the lesson that we should draw from this is a lesson from social theory, critical social theory, and particularly from feminist theory. That is, the lesson of standpoint. Any good theory of society has to be a standpoint theory. It has to understand that our knowledge of what a community is and what togetherness in a community is has to be defined by those without power. Those with power are comfortable with the status quo. Those with power are happy to go along with one homogeneous image of what the community is. We need to look to those without power, the standpoint of those without power, to really understand what the conflicts in a community are and to question an ideal of togetherness which blots out difference. To go beyond an ideal of togetherness to an idea of what togetherness really could be as collective solidarity, which draws people together and draws on the strengths of those from different positions in the community to really build something different